Hi, everybody. It's interesting to follow Kate because I actually am going to tell my own personal story that really illustrates some of that re-victimization that she's talking about, and just kind of a different take on the kinds of ways we can respond to sexual violence that isn't about the systems that be. So I'm going to read just because sometimes to this day telling my personal story makes me a little nervous, so please bear with me with the reading of this statement, as it were. As a young child, I was sexually abused by my father for several years. A respected social worker and fundraiser, active in the civil rights movement and the Jewish community, my father would return home at night from meetings and perpetrate sexual harm against me. Terrified and confused, I had no framework or tools to understand this abusive attention. I've come to understand retrospectively that my fear, profound sense of shame about what was being done to me, and a deep instinct to preserve my family's structure and parents' relationship kept me from telling anyone about the abuse. As a young adult, I finally sought help from counseling professionals and a community of other survivors of child sexual abuse. It was only then that I came to understand the personal and historical dynamics that led to my father's abuse and my mother's desperate complacence in the face of the abuse, and to develop a socio-political critique of factors that allow child sexual abuse and sexual violence generally to flourish unchecked. And despite my pain and outrage at how my father's abuse had destroyed aspects of my well-being, I continued to love my father and hold the knowledge that reporting on him would never have been an option for me. I knew instinctively then, as I know now as a professional working in the field of sexual violence prevention and sex offender policy, that disclosing what my father was doing would have resulted in my and my brother's placement in foster care, the disintegration of my family, and our subjection to the criminal justice and other systems, mechanisms responsible for responding to interpersonal harm. In the current policy environment around people who perpetrate child sexual abuse, my father would have been arrested, sentenced to lengthy incarceration, and upon release subjected to crushing isolation, demonization, and ongoing surveillance. I never would have wanted that for him. I simply wanted the abuse to stop and my father and family to get the support that we needed to be safe and happy. Retrospectively, I did want accountability for my father and for my mother, but it doesn't and it didn't look anything like what is called accountability by the criminal justice and other systems. My personal story is far from unique. Sexual violence is perpetrated in the United States at alarming rates. It's an intimate form of harm. A vast proportion of it is perpetrated by an individual close to the victim. Most often, the perpetrator is a friend, a spouse, a parent, a sibling, or other close relative. Not surprisingly, sexual violence is the crime least reported to the authorities. For instance, 51% of female victims are raped by an intimate partner and 40% by an acquaintance. Only 16% of rapes are ever reported to the authorities. Reports by men who have been sexually victimized are even less frequent. In the case of child sexual abuse, in which a full 93% of victims know the person who abused them, and that breaks down to about a third being close family members and almost 60% being acquaintances such as neighbors, teachers, clergy, friends of family. Meta-analysis from studies from around the world tell us that only 10 to 18% of incidents of child sexual abuse are ever reported to the authorities. We have evidence that the closer the relationship between the victim and the abuser, the less likely abuse is to be reported. I also believe that those numbers, the closeness of the relationship between the person who perpetrates and the person who's victimized, actually serve as kind of disincentives for prevention, for people paying attention to situations of risk and getting involved and preventing in the first place so that abuse is never perpetrated. I know, for instance, that my mother had little or no support and tools to stop my father's abuse of me before it started, or to intervene when she knew something very wrong was happening in our home. To this day, I fear, the kinds of supports my mother would have needed to prevent my father's abuse of me or to intervene and stop it have not been fine-tuned in ways that encourage and support prevention and intervention. To prevent sexual violence, we need to not rely on punishment as our only response. For this further pushes families and others underground in their shame and their pain and the fear of exploding relationships, families, and other structures. In the case of communities that have suffered systemic and social prejudice, racism, and abuse, there's even greater disincentive to disclosing abuse and seeking assistance from the systems that be. For instance, individuals and families from immigrant communities may forego reporting or seeking help, and we talked about this morning. Candace talked about it this morning. For fear of deportation and other kinds of retribution, communities of color may not want to report to Child Protective Services or the criminal justice system because of these systems' history of hyper-surveillance and abuse of their communities. Back in the late 1980s, some of our more forward-thinking and analytical feminists were starting to question the ways in which the women's movement, in its desperation, its justified desperation to get sexual assault to be taken seriously, had relied so heavily upon the state as the purveyors of accountability and punishment in situations of sexual violence. One of the most telling quotes from back then comes from a Norwegian feminist and criminologist named Liv Finstad, whose work I recommend. She wrote in 1990, "Today's systems abandon both the victim and the perpetrator of sexual violence, but we cling to a system that gives us so little and that is so damaging for us. We do it because there is no alternative. Since the court system and the prisons are the only things we have to deal with, we cling to what we have, although it is hideous also for us." These same systems that we have relied upon to intervene and dole out justice in situations of sexual violence are the same systems that likely had a hand in deterring reportage of sexual violence and in creating disincentives to its prevention. These are the same systems that have surveilled and harmed so many marginalized communities and been responsible for the mass incarceration of their community members and thus the partial disintegration of their communities. These are the same systems that have disproportionately applied the death penalty to their community members, that have seen to the disenfranchisement as workers and as voters of these community members. These are the systems of the state that wage unjust wars against innocent people in other countries, destroy ecosystems in the communities that live in them for financial gain, and foster a political economy that keeps millions of people disempowered and disenfranchised by poverty. And this is where I make the connection between sexual violence and women's reproductive rights. These are the same systems of the state that we rely upon to allow us our rights to make decisions about our bodies, pregnancy, and sex. I speak of these other ways in which we have granted or ceded control to the state and its system and its systems over our lives and communities in so many cases because they've let us down and they've harmed us as a result. Sorry, I'm mixing up my reading here, my notes here, so that we remember that it is not just women's bodies and autonomy that are threatened here. So I'm talking about all these other abuses of the state and its systems and how they oppress and subjugate other than women to faulty and really harmful systems. I was struck by the quote that's on the program by Irene Weiser, and I think Kim actually quoted it again today. The quote is, "The denial of women's autonomy is the essence of violence against women." And I just want to make the point that it is the denial of autonomy, freedom, and the means to flourish that is violence and destruction, not just towards women, but so many others as well. By prioritizing women and framing sexual violence as a women's issue, it's often called violence against women, and I tend to use the term sexual violence because I think we have to think more broadly. we're losing, when we do that, when we call it a women's issue and call it violence against women, we're losing all of the other ways in which violence is perpetrated by individuals, by one community against another, by the state through its law enforcement mechanisms, its criminal justice system, the military, sanctions against nations, the socio-political control of women's bodies, and the enforcement of norms of gender and sexuality. When we use the term violence against women, we are reifying the gender binary, that framework that facilitates and reinforces violence in our society. It's the same binary of race and class and perceptions of good versus evil that foster a polemic of violence and a polemic of power over. Not only is it a binary of opposites, male versus female, white people versus people of color, rich versus poor, but it's a binary that becomes value and power laden, allowing for wars upon other country and on our own citizens here in the United States. As I see it, our job as feminists is to hold the flame of compassion for all people who are struggling for freedom and justice, while at the same time we need to work furiously to shift these norms and social and political systems that oppress everyone. As feminists, we need to design creative solutions that address the complex, multi-layered issues that face us. We need to recognize the ways in which we as a society have to work to not just foster women's autonomy, safety, successes, and equality, but to end the dynamics that keep everyone and anyone disempowered.